decades. And since 1997 has focused much of her energy on understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She's also a retired obstetrician gynecologist who worked in healthcare reform and the women's movement for many years. Among her many, many accomplishments, she directed a documentary film, many of you may have seen, called Voices Across the Divide. She's published many books, some of which are here, including a young adult novel and a just published book for middle grades and a soon-to-be published memoir. Currently, she's very active in Jewish Voice for Peace as a member of the National JVP Health Advisory Council. Some of you may see the weekly reports that she puts out that are incredibly detailed and incredibly depressing. She's also on the board of the Gaza Mental Health Foundation, the Just World Educational, and We Are Not Numbers. Now we're going to hear from Alice, her report on the consequences of the Gaza war on health and human rights conditions.
So thank you so much. Am I talking loud enough for you, Jordan?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm not a quiet type. So thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here, particularly in a Jewish venue after I've been canceled by Dartmouth and Harvard Medical School twice this week. So I'm going to be focusing on the impact of war on maternal and newborn health in Gaza. So just for people who don't know, I've been to Gaza 4 times with various NGOs. And I've been always invited by the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. So I've done direct services, women's empowerment groups, and done a lot of interviewing and just general documentation and blogging and reporting. And as was mentioned, I'm involved with a number of groups that are involved in Gaza. So I'm just going to start out with something that I found really interesting, which is that the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in November, so a month into the war, put out predictions, a public health analysis. And they said there are multiple typologies. There we got here, armed conflict, forced displacement, the slow onset of food insecurity, a near complete blockade of humanitarian and other supply chains, high numbers, they thought at that point, of injuries and casualties, including medical personnel, and collapse of facilities and health service components. So they said, well, what's it going to look like? If this war drags on for another month, there will be insufficient dietary diversity, high levels of anemia, but low baseline acute malnutrition. If it drags on for 2 months, there's going to be obviously increasing malnutrition, and we will start seeing an increased burden of infant malnutrition because mothers are not able basically to breastfeed their babies and able to get formula and powder and mix it with clean water. If this goes for 3 to 6 months, there's going to be increased acute malnutrition and infections, epidemics of micronutrient deficiencies, and anemia. And this war is now in its 7th month. When they looked at maternal and neonatal outcomes, they said the first month we'll see some increased risk factors for poor pregnancy outcomes, related to stress, inadequately clean birth facilities, the fact that women will be giving birth without trained people, and neonates won't have pediatricians to help them. If it goes on for 2 months, there'll be, obviously, everything will be worse, and there'll also be reduced access to antenatal care and family planning. If it goes for 3 to 6 months, they said we're going to see a lot of worse birth outcomes, including things that we would think about, stillbirths, early neonatal and maternal deaths. And this will be because there's a lack of prenatal care, a lack of skilled birth attendants, inadequate nutrition, and an increase in the number of unwanted pregnancies. And they said there are going to be other issues if this war keeps going. There's going to be an increased burden of endemic infectious diseases, both the fecal oral diarrhea thing and airborne droplets. And most of this is going to be due to severe overcrowding and insufficient what's called WASH, which is water, sanitation, and hygiene. There's also going to be disruptions in treatment, and there's going to be increasing disease because malnourished people get sicker, and also the whole vaccination program is going to fall apart. Then they noted there's going to be interruptions in chronic disease care, particularly in insulin supply, and there's going to be increasing pulmonary disease because of all the dust and military poisons in the air. There's going to be increasing cancer because people aren't getting treatment. Chronic pulmonary and kidney disease is going to get worse because people aren't getting treatment. Cardiovascular disease is going to progress. Again, lack of treatment, and also because people will be so stressed. And on top of that, there will be war-related injuries, all of this impacting mental health. And they identified anxiety, depression, suicide, gender-based violence, and rising poverty.
What's GBV?
Gender-based violence.
Oh, yeah.
Violence against
You
women.
said that, yeah.
So what they said was by 3 to 6 months, there would be large numbers of women and children with severe malnutrition. There would be epidemics of nutritional deficiencies. With babies, there would be a rapid deterioration in their nutritional status because of maternal stress and poor breastfeeding. And they also noted that before the war, preventive reproductive and maternal and neonatal health was what they put relatively okay. So almost half of women had contraception. This was usually IUDs that were used for spacing. Almost everyone had more than 4 prenatal visits. Most people had a postnatal check. There was a high-risk pregnancy rate of about 10%, mostly diabetes and hypertension. The C-section rate was 22%, but the deaths in Gaza for mothers was very third world. It was mostly sepsis, infection, hemorrhage, bleeding to death, and pulmonary embolism. And they said all of these factors will deteriorate. So what this is telling us is that health occurs in a socio-political context. So if we look at Gaza, healthcare is provided in the context of a siege, checkpoints, closures, curfews, a strict permitting system that prevents everyone and everything from coming in or going out, a separation wall or militarized fence along the perimeter, repeated Israeli incursions, occasional massive assaults, multiple detentions, and factional violence. And I think there's some ethical questions we should also be thinking about. What is the role of international law? What happens with collective civilian punishment and severe restrictions of access? What happens when a population is ghettoized, where there's a lot of incarceration, especially of children? And what about the proportionality in war? So we know that healthcare and healing occur in a socio-political context. So I would propose that we need to look for political solutions to health and human rights issues. And it's important to ask, why is life expectancy in Israel 10 years more than the West Bank and Gaza? Why is maternal mortality 9 to 10 times greater in the territories than in Israel? Now, I want to just briefly talk about Israeli apartheid and war crimes. In 2021, a number of human rights organizations came out saying that the practices of the Israeli government were consistent with apartheid. And this is a quote from B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization. And they said, quote, "A regime that uses laws, practices, and organized violence to establish and maintain the supremacy of one group over another is an apartheid regime." Now, I became acquainted with the idea of medical apartheid during the beginnings of the COVID pandemic, because you can see I'm a sort of documentarian type. So when COVID came out, I did a weekly report from Israel and the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem about what the COVID status was. And what I learned was that the Oslo Accords in 1993 set up the Palestinian Authority, and they were supposed to set up a healthcare system and run it in the territories. But they were predated by the Geneva Accords, which mandated that the occupying power, in this case Israel, is always responsible to combat contagious diseases and epidemics in whatever they're occupying. So what I saw in doing these reports is that the Israeli government wanted Palestinians in the territories to have the responsibilities of sovereignty, in other words, providing healthcare and taking care of patients, without the benefits of sovereignty, having resources and control over the system. So what that meant is the response to the pandemic totally depended on your geographic, ethnic, and political status. Now, I'm going to read the thing on the left because it's the take-home message. More than 75 years of Israeli domination and dispossession has affected Palestinian life through occupation, siege, annexation, de-development, and permanent displacement of refugees, severely impacting the ability of Palestinians to access the essential building blocks of health. The fragmentation of society and destruction of the ability and opportunity to create essential institutions involved in healthcare has created a reality that is recognized today as medical apartheid, 2 separate systems, 2 separate realities. And we see this in the impact and the disparities in things like life expectancy and maternal and infant mortality. Now, medical apartheid doesn't happen accidentally. The Israeli government had a policy of de-development of the healthcare system. So they wouldn't let equipment in, they wouldn't let replacement parts in, they wouldn't let providers leave the strip to get higher level training. They actively shoved the healthcare system backwards. And then with the medical permits, if someone needed high level care, which was not available in Gaza, they had to go through all sorts of bureaucratic hoops to get the permits to go into the East Jerusalem or into Jordan or wherever they were going. And those are hard to get and often unsuccessful. And so there was this chronic difficulties with lack of medicines and equipment. And then on top of that, direct attacks on the system in the face of high levels of conflict-related trauma. I also want to put out there that I do think there's an effect between Zionism and medicine. In 2018, the nation-state bill was passed by the Israeli Knesset, their parliament, and this said that Jewish citizens are privileged in Israel over Palestinian citizens. So there is a legal institutionalized racism in the country. So the question is, given that that's the way it is there, are Jewish Israeli clinicians able to see Palestinian citizens of Israel or Palestinians anywhere as fellow equal human beings? And in November of last year, 100 Jewish Israeli doctors signed a letter approving the bombing of Gaza hospitals. I'm going to talk about the right to health in its broadest sense, as defined by Physicians for Human Rights Israel. So they looked at the right to health, which involves freedom of movement and access to health services, and then all the kinds of things that make a healthy society. Clean water, sanitation, nutrition, housing, education, employment, these are not great mysteries, as well as the ability to live in a nonviolent society. And the picture on the right is a patient education pamphlet from the Palestinian Medical Relief Society. So when you're pregnant, you get the brochure about breastfeeding and taking your calcium and all that kind of stuff. And you get a brochure about what to do if you're stuck in labor at a checkpoint. Now, I keep talking about international humanitarian law. This was codified in the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949, which was designed to protect civilians in times of war and to treat as war crimes various things like the murder of civilians, torture, rape, hostage taking. So it's part of international law. It's how relations between states are supposed to be governed. Subsequently, there were more protocols, for instance, relating to the protection of victims in armed conflicts. And then there were other agreements like prohibiting certain weaponry or military tactics. And then in 2000, we had the protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the involvement of children in armed conflict. So if we look at healthcare in Palestine, according to The Lancet, which is a prominent British journal, they described it as fragmented and incoherent. And this was before October. So how is the healthcare system run? There is the Ministry of Health, which was established in '94 after Oslo, which is supposed to make the healthcare system occur and happen. There's the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is UNRWA, which was set up in 1950 to provide healthcare and education and various other services to the people who were created as refugees in the 1948 war. So there are 8 incredibly overcrowded refugee camps in Gaza. There are 23 in the West Bank, and there's a whole bunch in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Then we have all the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs, like Palestinian Medical Relief Society, and we also have private providers. And on top of that, we have the Israeli government de-developing everybody. And you should know that if you're a Palestinian living in East Jerusalem and Israel, what we call Israel 48, the Israel with the armistice line of 48, we have your dinner in the back that way. You have access to 5 HMOs as well as private care. So you're in a whole different medical world. Now, I just want to be sure everybody's on top of the facts of occupation. After the 48 war, Gaza was controlled by Egypt. And it was occupied by the Israeli forces in 1967. And then the Israelis encouraged Jewish settlers to move in. And then in 2005, they withdrew them unilaterally. The following year, Hamas won a legislative election, which was certified as democratic by our friend Jimmy Carter. And then the following year, there was a civil war between Hamas and Fatah. Fatah was partly funded by the US of A. And Hamas won. And then Israel, backed by the US, set up a very strict and brutal siege as punishment to try to topple Hamas. Since then, there have been multiple Israeli assaults, 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, 2022, and then the one that started in 23. And so when I would talk to young Gazans, they would tell me how many wars they'd been through. So every young Gazan had been through so many wars. In addition, there was a thing called the Great March of Return from 2018 to 2019, which was a weekly march to the perimeter almost entirely nonviolent, demanding various rights. And this was met by Israeli snipers who had a policy of shooting at the legs of the protesters. So there were massive amounts of orthopedic injuries that were not easily treated in a place like Gaza. And I have the picture on the right, which I took in 2014, just to remind myself to tell you that the things we're going to be talking about are not new. This is a horse-drawn cart bringing canisters of fuel to people because there's never regular electricity. So people had their own little generators. So there are particular challenges for women in Gaza. It partly depends on your socioeconomics. Are you living in an urban setting where you have more opportunity? Are you in a rural setting, which is poorer? Women tend to marry early. They tend to have large families. They tend to be totally responsible for these children. There are fairly conservative attitudes towards what women are supposed to be doing, and also conservative attitudes towards LGBTQI people. There's a tremendous cultural stigma against admitting to mental health and admitting to having mental illness and needing treatment. There's an immense amount of poverty. It was about 50% before the war started, maybe more like 70% in college-educated people. And there was a certain level of gender-based violence. And I interviewed a whole number of women about this. And the story I kept getting was, I had a decent husband. He was captured by the Israelis for something, whether he did it or not, went to jail in an Israeli prison, was totally brutalized for 3, 4, 5 years, gets dumped back into Gaza. He's a broken man. He can't find employment. His children don't recognize him. He's, has a lot of mental illness and PTSD, and he's totally enraged, and he beats his wife. And that's sort of the pattern that women kept telling me about. And there's also racism in this society. So if you look at Gazans, there are blonde, blue-eyed Gazans, and there are Gazans that look like they're from Africa because they are from Africa, particularly Chad. And so the darker you are in the society, the less value you have as a woman. Women tend to be highly educated. About half of universities are women, but there's no jobs for them. So they suffer from occupation, sees tremendous amounts of loss and trauma. They also suffer from the fact that there's a range of health provider skills due to lack of training and difficulties in access and funding. There's also a lack of screening, such as diagnostic or therapeutic options. Mammograms are very, very rare. So cancer is a really tough thing for women there. And then they have all the challenges of getting permits for high-level care. They also have tremendous strengths. Women are the main cohesive force within the family. Mother's Day in Gaza is like unbelievable. It's like July 4th. It's unbelievable. They are highly valued. They have multi-generational supports and connections because families tend to live together. They're famous for their samud, their persistence and their power. And they tend to be educated, as I said, and they have a huge amount of pride in things like cooking and this joy and love of life that I'm always stunned by when I'm in Gaza. Now, for anyone who doesn't know this, can you see my pointer? Yeah, okay. So this is Israel here. This is the Mediterranean. This is Egypt to the south, Jordan to the west, then Syria and Lebanon. And this is the West Bank, this kidney bean thing. And this is the Gaza Strip. So the Gaza Strip, if you blow it up, the northern crossing is the Erez crossing. That's where people like me go in and out. The southern crossing down here, you've heard a lot about the Rafah crossing. This is the crossing with Egypt. And then there's another crossing right around the bend, which is Kerem Shalom, which is the other crossing into Israel that has had a, whoops, don't do that to me. And then there's some economic crossings along here. So Gaza is tiny. It's 6 miles by 28 miles in size. So if you put the whole Gaza Strip on the state of Massachusetts, you can see just how ridiculously small it is. So if we look at the medical institutions before the last aggression started, there were 13 governmental hospitals, there were 142 primary health centers, some run by the Ministry of Health, some by UNRWA for the refugees. 70% of Gazans are refugees, some run by NGOs, and there were a bunch of private hospitals. There were 2 medical schools. There were nursing schools and other professional schools, but there's a tremendous disconnect between the professional trained people and the paid jobs available. So there were estimated 120 nursing positions open every year and 5,000 nursing students. There were less than 20 psychiatrists in Gaza and less than 7 were physicians. But before October, there were big health issues. Electricity, as I said, was kind of shaky, 4 to 8 hours per day, and not always at the same time. There were fuel shortages because the hospitals had to run on generators, so if they didn't have the fuel, they couldn't stay open. And then we talked about the restrictions of permits and medicine and equipment. So this resulted in a lack of specialists. The medical personnel are exhausted. They're devoted, they're heroes, but they're exhausted. Many of them have been unpaid for months. And the COVID-19 pandemic really put an immense stress on the salaried professionals. Now we need to pay attention to UNRWA because 70% of Gazans are refugees. So the orange one slashed UNRWA funding when he came to power. This was partially restored by Biden with a big vote on partially. And UNRWA was limping along and threatening to close at any minute because it was just having major budget crisis after budget crisis. Then on January 26th, the Israeli government accused UNRWA of having 12 employees who participated in the horrific Hamas attack. 20 countries, without any further investigation, without demanding any evidence, anything, just immediately suspended funding. Some of those countries have come back, as you can see, and some of them never stopped. And you have to wonder whether there is some organized plan by Israel, maybe backed by the US, to destroy UNRWA. In our own lovely Congress, there have been about 8 bills filed to eliminate UNRWA and to stop US aid to countries that are willing to fund UNRWA. In Israel, Israeli authorities have tried to evict UNRWA from their headquarters of 75 years or something, and it was finally vacated because there was an arson attack about 2 weeks ago. And Israeli authorities have done things like disrupt visas for people who work in UNRWA, get rid of their tax exemption status, close their bank accounts, prevent access of staff into their East Jerusalem headquarters. They're really trying to make it impossible. On January 31st, Netanyahu said that UNRWA was, quote, in the service of Hamas, which is a total lie. And many Israeli officials are calling for donors to cease funding. And I just want to make it clear that if UNRWA is destroyed, this will undermine education, health, and a whole host of other services that are essential to the human rights and continued existence of Palestinian refugees created not only in 1948, but also in 1967 when there was a whole new wave of refugees. In our wonderful Congress in March, the Congress people voted to bar any UNRWA funding through March of 2025, and we were one of the biggest UNRWA funders. And they cut funding to the UN Human Rights Council unless they certified it was taking, quote, significant steps to remove Israel as a permanent agenda item. They also, Congress also banned the funding to the UN Commission of Inquiry on Israel, and they voted to limit aid to the Palestinian Authority if the authority initiated or supported any investigations in the International Criminal Court regarding Israeli crimes against Palestinians. And in the midst of this, we have 2.3 million Gazans, 50% of them under the age of 18. So what we have seen in the last 7 months is the total disintegration of the healthcare system. More than 35,500 people have been killed, half of them women and children. That's an estimate of about 2 mothers per hour. Almost 80,000 people have been injured, and 75% of them are female. The Hamas attack killed 1,162 people. Israeli soldiers that are killing and doing their thing in Gaza, 282 have been killed, and 1,745 have been injured. At this point, the estimation of the number of hostages is about 128. So if you look at the pattern of Israeli airstrikes, they bombed homes, civilian gatherings, markets, houses of worship, bakeries, restaurants, banks, ATMs, hospitals, healthcare facilities, ambulances. They created a full electricity blackout and a lack of fuel. And at this point, if you look at Gaza's hospitals, 15 of them are partially functional, with partially being minimal. And people flock to these hospitals because they think it's going to be safer. So they're massively overcrowded. Like they'll have 30,000 people that are just gathered around the hospital. And obviously with the wounded and the sick, they're massively overcrowded as well. And I want to say something about hospitals and international law. There's the Geneva Conventions from 1929, Article 19, that stated that medical establishments, staff, and patients should not be attacked during times of war. So the bar for hospitals to lose what's called a protected status is very high. They have to be proven to be involved in acts harmful to the enemy. And analysts and experts agree that none of those conditions were met on any of the 36 hospitals that have been damaged or destroyed. It is also stated in this convention that military are required to protect patients and staff. So it seems, looking at the pattern, that there is a deliberate Israeli attack on healthcare. More than 755 aid workers and medical personnel have been killed. Hundreds have been arrested and detained. 130 ambulances have been destroyed. Almost 200 UN staff have been killed. And thus 2/3 of the hospitals and UNRWA centers are basically unable to function. Clinicians also report major unusual burns on the dead and the wounded, suggestive of white phosphorus, which burns on the skin and is difficult to put out. And there are currently 8 field hospitals functioning that have been brought in by aid groups. 60% of the housing units have been destroyed. 75% of the population is internally displaced, which means they're living in horrific conditions. and there are massive shortages of water, medicine, and widespread hunger, reaching levels of famine and starvation. In northern Gaza, the average intake since January is 245 calories a day. I know a doctor who's a psychiatrist who recently got out. He was sheltering in Rafah after fleeing from Khan Yunis, and he's a skinny guy, and he lost 30 pounds during the course of this war. We see increasing intercommunal tension, so the society is falling apart a bit, and also increasing levels of gender-based violence. And in the midst of this, there are between 50 and 60,000 pregnant women. About 63 women are killed daily. There are 17,000 Palestinian children orphaned. And there's a new category when they rescue a child or an infant from a bombed building and the child is the only survivor and no one can figure out who the child is. This is a child without living relatives. It's a new medical category they have in Gaza. And obviously this has devastating impacts on agriculture, agri-food infrastructure, water, soil and ground, air, everything is getting polluted. And the sewage pumping isn't working. It's estimated there are 270,000 tons of accumulated waste. All the wastewater treatment plants are down. So what this means is that raw sewage is being pumped and dumped into the Mediterranean Sea, where people are bathing, washing their clothes, occasionally drinking the water. Everything got worse in the winter when it was rainy because raw sewage started flooding through the streets. Because of these horrific hygiene situations, not surprisingly, there are a whole bunch of diseases that are significantly increased, including chickenpox, scabies, lice, diarrhea, respiratory illnesses, and hepatitis A. And I wrote an article, an op-ed that was published in the New York Times about a pregnant woman that I was in touch with, and her newborn got hepatitis A and fortunately recovered. It's estimated that there are over 10,000 cancer patients at risk for death and 350,000 people with chronic diseases untreated. And the big issue is the lack of dialysis units because there's almost no dialysis available. This obviously affects everyone's mental health, particularly children. And there are reports now of children developing convulsions from anxiety. Bedwetting has been a chronic problem ever since I've been going to Gaza. This is the way children express their feelings about living in Gaza, spiking. And children are very afraid, they're getting more aggressive, they're very nervous, and are refusing to leave their parents' sides. And UNICEF has said that Gaza is now the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. So it's estimated that there are more than 1 million children that need mental health and psychosocial support. The big problem with this also is that the mental health providers also fled the north, also are living in tents, also are starving. They're experiencing the same level of trauma as their patients. And it should be noted that the most recent numbers, there are about 46% of patients who were requesting medical evacuation because they're critically ill have been approved. 38% have been actually evacuated. And since the Israeli forces took over Gaza a few weeks ago, they are evacuating 0 people. So this is how Rafah looks in May. More than half of Gaza's 2.3 million people were sheltering in Rafah, in mostly tents and rickety shelters in the rubble, desperate need for everything. And then Netanyahu comes along and says they have to evacuate and that there's going to be a ground invasion. And he says there'll be safe zones. Well, there are no safe zones and everybody's worried about impending massacre. The other thing is that in terms of humanitarian aid was primarily coming through that southern Rafah crossing and Karam Shalom, which was the crossing right east of that, that goes to Israel. But there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trucks full of aid that are and medical supplies are waiting to get in, and they get in a little bit and then a little bit and then. And since May 7th, both crossings have been closed. And on the 22nd, the United Nations announced that it had suspended all food aid to Rafah because they had no food. And they also had no security, no de-escalated zones that they could drive food to if they had any food, and they have none. There's a little trickle of airdrops and ship stocking and all that kind of stuff, a totally inadequate and ridiculous way to provide aid. And you should remember that once the aid ends up there, it has to be carried somewhere, it has to be shipped, it has to be distributed. All of that has fallen apart. There's also a telecom blackout most of the time, so people can't communicate. There's flour here, they can't tell people because there's no way to communicate. I also want to mention that the libraries, the archives, the museums, and all the universities have been largely damaged or destroyed. So people are talking about a sociocide. So now we have the escalated attacks in Rafah happening. 900,000 people have left Rafah. So these people have been displaced 3, 4, 5, 6 times. And this is out of fear and that there's going to be an assault. The UNICEF executive director said a ground operation in Rafah, quote, would bring catastrophe on top of catastrophe, highlighting the unimaginable toll the war is having on children, There are 600,000 children now, obviously less because so many people left, crammed into Rafah, nearly all either injured, sick, malnourished, traumatized, or living with disabilities. So just to show you, this is the southern tip of Gaza with Egypt here and Israel here. So this is eastern Rafah, which was told to evacuate, and they were told to go this way towards the Mediterranean to Al Mawazi, which was quote the humanitarian zone. And just to give you a sense, this picture on the bottom is Al Mawazi in February. So you can see it has a tremendous amount of space for more people to come. So people are starting now to move further north into Khan Yunis and into Deir al-Balah. But it's just catastrophic because there's no support for them. There's no aid. So in the north, we need to remember that there's still people in the north. There's 600,000 people, and they have little to no access to healthcare. Also, there are more unexploded missiles and bombs in Gaza than anywhere in the world since World War II. In addition, Israeli protesters have been blocking the aid trucks when they were trying to get in since January, and they've started burning the trucks and just dumping all the aid on the ground. And as I said, since Israel seized Rafah, there is no aid. And in the midst of this, Palestinian armed groups are continuing their indiscriminate rocket fire into Israel and on the ground fighting. And then we have all the civilians. We have what appears to most people to be a genocide with multiple war crimes. Now, I want to walk you through Al-Shifa Hospital just to give you a flavor for what it means to destroy a hospital. Al-Shifa Hospital was the main hospital in Gaza City, 700 beds, a big complex with 1,500 medical staff, a very important hospital. And before November 15th, they had been bombarded a couple of times. And so the Israeli forces hit the specialized surgeries department, coronary care division, a warehouse, the maternity floor, and the outpatient clinic. On November 15th, troops and tanks entered. They started taking control of various sections of the hospital. They took nephrology and internal medicine, and they detonated a medicine storehouse. At that point, since people had heard this was going to happen, it peaked at about 40,000, but there were only 7,000 people there, and they were all sheltering. Then on the 15th, the Israelis said, you have 1 hour to leave, which was impossible. And there was no transport. It was just a catastrophe. And the situation was described as causing a great state of panic and fear. So many people left on foot, and they left pushing gurneys with patients on them, pushing wheelchairs. It was just crazy. And the ones who couldn't leave were left behind with a small medical staff. Then the Israeli troops ordered all young men on the grounds to surrender, and they took them captive. Dozens of people, displaced people, relatives of patients, and many Palestinian men reported being interrogated. Some were stripped naked to their underwear, blindfolded, just awful kind of torture kind of situation. Some just taken away. And Israel accused Hamas of placing a command center below Al-Shifa Hospital, which the hospital officials denied. And I should say, I know a number of international doctors who've done a lot of work at Al-Shifa, and they say repeatedly there was no command center at Al-Shifa. Now, the New York Times got in shortly after that. They found the findings of some kind of center completely unconvincing. This is a famous picture of babies that were in the NICU, and the incubators failed because there was no electricity, so they snuggled them all up, hoping they would keep each other warm. So obviously, anybody who needed electricity had a tendency to die, so NICU and ICU. The hospital barely limped along until February, where they got a little more functioning with some fuel resupply. Then March 18th, there was a massive attack. At that point, there were 30,000 people sheltering at this hospital. This attack lasted until March 31st. Now, I just want to say that Ehud Barak on CNN during the middle of this mess told the interviewer that Israeli engineers had built the tunnels under Al-Shifa Hospital in the 1980s to increase hospital capacity. And then he said, it's a high-risk area. We build tunnels under every hospital. All our hospitals have tunnels. What's the big fuss? He was like that kind of talk, and no one seemed to pick on that. So as of March 31st, this is Al-Shifa, the Israeli forces claimed they had a, quote, precise operation. They killed about 300 people. They went in with 6 tanks and 100 commandos. They arrested over 900 people and claimed they found major Hamas stockpiles and many terrorists. And the Hamas and hospital staff all denied that this was true. And people there described bodies everywhere, tanks, going over bodies, huge destruction, dead children, just a complete horrific mess. Doctors described being stripped, being humiliated, being detained, being arrested, and some go off to prison and die in prison. Patients died because of the situation. Patients' companions were arrested. Some were just executed or just displaced. This is a picture of Al-Shifa Hospital on April 8th. So that's what it means when Israelis destroy a hospital. If that was not bad enough, the Palestinians started finding mass graves. So on May 6th, there were a total of 8 mass graves at 3 different hospitals. They'd unearthed over 520 bodies. The workers said, quote, "It felt like pulling my heart out of the earth." And whenever a mass grave is found, then hundreds and hundreds of Gazans flocked looking for evidence of their lost relatives. And the UN described this as including women and children, with many reportedly showing signs of torture, summary execution, and potential instances of people buried alive. And the Israeli forces denied they had anything to do with this. Now I'm going to focus on pregnant women because I'm an OB. So there are about 5,500 births per month. Most of these women have no prenatal care. Most of them are displaced, and most of them have no idea where they're going to deliver. So that's about 183 women a day giving birth without adequate prenatal care. Some are undergoing cesareans without painkillers. If women make it to a hospital, which you can risk your life trying to get to the hospital, they're competing with all the injured and with the lack of beds and all that kind of stuff. So women tend to be discharged within a few hours of having a baby, and then they go back to the rubble or to the tent or some totally ridiculous situation. So women are giving births in shelters in their homes. I've heard of women giving birth in cars, in the streets, in overwhelmed facilities. The sanitation, as you can imagine, is horrific. The risk of infection and medical complications is on the rise. And to add insult to injury, there are no hygiene products for postpartum women. So this lack of food and clean water, the ongoing starvation, dehydration affects everybody. It's particularly bad for pregnant women, postpartum women, and babies. So it affects the mother and the baby. It affects bonding. It really affects breastfeeding. If you're dehydrated and starving, you're not able to breastfeed your baby. So we're expecting to see, when the numbers are collected, if they ever are, maternal deaths rising. And I should just add that so many babies are being born outside of the hospital that there's an unknown number that are never be registered. So we won't know how many of these unregistered babies ever died because they were never registered as having been born. So this is a messy, messy area. So this has a psychological toll on reproductive health. There's been a 300% rise in what they are calling stress-induced miscarriages. There are rises in congenital abnormalities, stillbirths, and premature births. And this obviously has a multi-generational impact. I want to talk about the crime of genocide, since we're on a very cheerful day today. So the International Court of Justice, which is a UN court, was handed a complaint in January from South Africa accusing Israel of a genocidal intent. And just so you know, in 1948, there was the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So they defined what is genocide. It's acts committed to destroy a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Acts include killing members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life, calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. So Ireland joined South Africa. Nicaragua accused Germany of facilitating genocide because Germany is the second highest funder after the US. Egypt joined South Africa. The International Court of Justice did a new provisional measure saying you have to let food in and stop famine. And the interesting thing about their initial decision, it takes months to get a final decision. They said South Africa has standing to do this. This could be a genocide. Palestinians are a protected group. They reviewed the conditions in Gaza, which, as you can see, are horrific. They also reviewed the language coming out of Israeli ministers, the ministers who call for another Nakba, who call Palestinians animals. I mean, it's genocidal language coming out of the government. And they said Israel must take action to prevent genocidal acts, which would make you think they think there are genocidal acts, and increase aid. Report back in a month, I don't know if they did, and Hamas has to release the hostages. So from March to May, there were multiple calls for ceasefire, hostage release. The UN Security Council finally adopted a ceasefire resolution and a release all hostages. The UN Human Rights Council said that they think it's a genocide. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights said that this military campaign amounts to genocide and the country should have sanctions on Israel and an arms embargo. Then Netanyahu called the news of a possible International Criminal Court arrest, which is a different court. So the International Criminal Court can go after people. So he heard they might go after him, and he said this is an anti-Semitic hate crime. The court talked back to him and said, don't undermine our impartiality. And Biden is beginning to start to hear the music, and he gets a little nervous. So he halts weapons supplies over fears of a Rafah invasion. And then about a week later, he arranged for $1 billion worth of military aid to get into Israel anyway. South Africa made its third attempt to get the International Court of Justice to restrain Israel in Rafah. And then we see massive protests in cities and colleges. And then this week, the International Criminal Court is now officially seeking arrest warrants for several Israeli and Hamas leaders. This was the Boston Globe on the 21st. So we're in really uncharted, unprecedented territory because this has never happened before. And I'm sure Netanyahu doesn't like to be on the same page as the head of Hamas. You know, there are two faces there. So when we look at what's going to happen in the future, that same London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, working with Johns Hopkins, recently put out predictions on what's going to happen. So they said, over the next 6 months, if there's no epidemics and there's a ceasefire, 6,550 excess deaths will happen. So people will die from infection, they'll die from their injuries, and they'll die from untreated chronic disease. If the status quo continues, there are going to be 58,000 deaths, excess deaths. If there's an escalation, there's going to be 74,000 deaths. And then they ran all their little epidemic numbers and everything. And they said, well, if there's an epidemic, the numbers, for instance, under escalation would be 85,750 excess deaths, which is horrific. They said that there's going to be 22% more children less than 6 suffering from severe malnutrition. They also noted that because the Israeli forces have targeted the medical schools and the staff, that Gaza is going to lack training capacity. And so the questions we need to ask are, what is the endpoint for this war? Will UNRWA survive? And if they don't survive, who's going to do what UNRWA is doing? Are Israeli forces going to reoccupy Gaza? Not that they ever fully left. Will they bring in Jewish settlers? There are all sorts of settlers that are planning their beachfront properties. Will Gazans be able to return to the north? If they return, what are they returning to? Or will Gazans be displaced to Egypt, to the Sinai, because Egypt has built camps to absorb Gazans? And is that going to happen? And then who's going to pay for this rebuilding? What's the future of Hamas? Hamas is not going to get destroyed by Israel. It's a political movement. What's the future of the Palestinian Authority? The prime minister and his cabinet resigned. They've got some new guys. I'm sure they're not any better than the old guys. We don't know what kind of position they're going to be in. And then are the Arab countries going to have any say here, or as peacekeepers or whatever? So I think if you look at the socio-political situation, what we're seeing is a lot of structural racism, apartheid, cross-generational trauma, and what really looks like revenge. We're seeing an Israeli reliance on military solutions to political problems with a real disregard for the health and lives of Palestinian people. And we need to remember that Israel is the occupying power and is actually responsible for the health of the people they occupy. So the crux of the problem, if we look at the fact that about 5.3% of Gazans are dead or injured, if that was the United States, that would be 18 million people. So the status quo can only continue if we as human beings see Jews as more human, more deserving, more innocent, more honorable than Palestinian Arabs. If we as a community are blind to Arab suffering and the history of settler colonialism. So the fundamental issues come down to racism, which potentially leads to ethnic cleansing and genocide. And so, Hamas war crimes do not justify an Israeli genocide. Racism and revenge, violations of international law, collective punishment, this is the list of what we're looking at. So clearly the health of Palestinians is intrinsically linked to their liberation and the end of the siege. But the work that we need to do immediately is a ceasefire and massive humanitarian aid and release the hostages. That's our marching papers. But it's also clear that if we don't address the root causes and hold the countries responsible who make this possible, it's just going to happen again. Again, ending military solutions to political problems. Now, if you're in a professional organization or a healthcare organization, I think that there is a tremendous responsibility, particularly in medicine, to get professional organizations to speak out. When the Ukrainian war started, lots of different medical professional organizations issued their, whatever, appalling, blah, blah, blah. There's been nothing from any professional organization except the American Public Health Association. And that's really shameful. There are groups in the healthcare system like Healthcare Workers for Palestine, Doctors Against Genocide, the group that I work with, Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council, that's doing some kinds of organizing and work. The website, jvphealth.org, is where you can get a weekly update if you want to know what's going on. And I, on my website, have a lot of information. And then there's a whole host of organizations that are working intimately in the Strip and are successful at getting in. Right now, very few are successful because no one's getting in. And so, as I said, we need to be working as people, as citizens, for a ceasefire. So that means that we need to not only educate ourselves, but we need to go back to our communities, our unions, our organizations, and really challenge mainstream media, support the students that are being so brave, I suggest people call, write, or visit your officials regularly, like every day if possible, just so they know you're out there. Sign every call for ceasefire, write letters of protest. You got to be doing all that stuff. And then we need to be out protesting and demonstrating and mobilizing communities. I think it's important, obviously, to support organizations that are doing work here and in Gaza. This is a time to promote boycott, divestment, and sanction. And I think we can't stop until there's a ceasefire, humanitarian aid, and hostage release. And Karen has, where are you, Karen? Yeah, because it's something we can do. Karen has another thing that we can do. So she's gonna share that with you. While she's coming up here, I can say that the group I work with, We Are Not Numbers, has been working hard to stay in touch with the writers in Gaza, so they know that we're thinking about them. We're publishing their stories. We're doing GoFundMe campaigns, trying to get them out. We're supporting young Gazans to get scholarships in universities, because so many of them have had their university educations disrupted. We helped fund a solar panel group that found a bunch of solar panels in Gaza and then was hooking them up to families related to this We Are Not Numbers program, so the students could write their reports, but then the family all had electricity, and then the people around them had electricity. So there are all these sort of local initiatives that are going on.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Karen Klein. I'm on the committee that works on Mr. Palestine and Worker Circle. There are plenty of ways to help and support, and the urgent issues of, healthcare and water and all of that is important. But there's some small project that I thought I might mention because it connects us to Worker Circle folks in New York
Is it
City.
okay if I show
There's a
that?
woman working on this, and also because Alice has worked on We Have Not Numbered. So one of the parents at the Shola in Brooklyn is full-time working on a program called the Gaza Scholarship Fund for Displaced Students. And what they've been doing, this is like little by little, they've been helping students apply to universities who are in universities in Gaza that have been destroyed to continue or finish to start their college or university training. And they've successfully gotten several students scholarships paid for, and they've been trying to collect money for housing and food and all of that sort of thing. We actually almost had someone in Boston, but the school reneged on the scholarship, so that doesn't seem to have worked. But we'd already found somebody who could do housing here. And she has a couple students going to NYU and to Bard. And so I thought, we could do some little thing here if we all wanted to contribute a little bit. It would just feel like we had a connection. So we're going to pass around. I'll leave these at the front desk. I have I just Xerox, old fashioned, we didn't make a slide, which tells you about it.
Couldn't figure out.
I couldn't have a slide. And it has the website on top, or you can pick up one of these little guys. Here's the website, and hopefully you can put it on the Zoom so they can copy it, or you can take a picture of it and make a donation. This money is going directly 100% to help these few students. It's kind of like that turtle project, little turtles on the ground, you can't help anybody. You throw one back in, you go, well, I helped that one. So it's a small thing we could do. I think it would feel good. And Michelle Lerner, who is the Shula parent, would really love knowing that we were helping to support
And
this.
she's the one who's doing the We Are Not Numbers. It's the same.
Yes, she's part of We Are Not Numbers. This is not a We Are Not Numbers program, but it's very connected because these are all students. And the other thing I want to say, I realized is that Brookline is having, is voting on ceasefire on May 28th, I believe. 30th, May 30th. So there's a vigil, and you probably know this better just because we have a lot of Brookline folks here. Just
I can do that.
a quickie thing to do.
Can you put that online?
Can we put this online? Well,
Yeah.
maybe we can send this to all the people who registered. I'll find out if we know how to do that.
Jordan, do we have the Zoom people too? I don't see them.
I'm trying to unpin.
Oh, okay. All right, so there is a standout for ceasefire in Brookline at 6 o'clock at the high school on May 30th. Boston Workers Circle has endorsed this, I think it's called a warrant. So this is for those of you that are BWC members, a kind of official BWC action. And while Brookline residents can go into the town meeting on that day, the rest of us who don't live in Brookline can come and show our support for the warrant at the standout at 6 o'clock at the high school.
So I just wanted to say that it's very moving to me to be able to do this talk in person in a Jewish setting, since I'm writing an op-ed called Banned in Boston because that's what's been going on. I'm also here because of a book tour, because